Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, a Cadence independent media production. If you're just joining us or new to the channel, we talk about tuning and tone and tips and hacks and myth busting, things like that. And today we're doing a deep dive on something that I'm curious about, which is what happens when you tune, detune, modify just one lug on each of the drums. Alright, so now if you're on the internet, like we all are, you've probably seen at least people talking about this, if not actually doing it in their videos, which is taking one, maybe two lugs, but oftentimes just one, super far down in some kind of direction to like change crosstalk between the drums or for a sound thing, that kind of thing. We're talking about sound today specifically. And we're going to do it with the snare, both the toms and the bass drum, and just see what the results are of horsing around with one lug when the rest of the drum is in tune with itself. Thanks again to our presenting sponsor, Promark by D'Addario, for helping us out. I'm doing Rebound Balance 55As today, and they are super fun. It's actually my first time playing with them, and it's been a blast. All right, let's just jump right in here. So first of all, there are a lot of variables here that are specific to the drums that you have that might be different than the drums that we have. The normal kit here, which is our Pearl Masters Custom here, has die-cast hoops on it. That's going to influence the behavior here. We are also using Evans heads, as most of you probably already know, which means that we are dealing with their flesh hoop system, their collar system, all of that. So if you use different brands, you might have a slightly different adventure when you do this. And this also goes for what tuning range you generally tune your drums in, which we're going to talk about later. On our snare today, we have a UV1 batter and we have a 300 snare side. On the toms, we have EC2 clear batters, and we have G1s on the bottom. And on the bass drum, we have an EMAD batter and an EQ3 Reso with a port. Now, the guy that I see doing this the most, or I would say utilizing this the most, is Ash Sohn. He does a lot of great Instagram videos playing grooves to cool tracks and getting really unusual sounds out of unexpectedly sized drums, particularly little toms and big bass drums and things like that. And it's super fun, and a lot of them sound almost synthetic or like some kind of sample that isn't just like a ringy snare drum tuned in a nice comfy pitch range, which a lot of us are also trying to get. And what we're doing today is just seeing kind of what happens when we choose a tuning scheme that kind of runs the gamut from a pretty high-tuned snare to a fairly low-tuned floor tom. The rack tom is kind of in the upper range, but not high, just like middle of the road. And the bass drum is just sort of how we normally tune it, which is like past finger tight, but not a whole lot past finger tight, and the front head is pretty loose. Now let's go around each one of these and find out what it's sounding like from the get-go before we mess with anything. So pretty much kind of par for the course with what we normally do here when we're just doing regular drum stuff. The snare is a little bit higher maybe than I normally would do, but it's definitely right in the range of things that I consider to be usable. First adventure is we're going to tune completely down one lug in each drum, and then I'm just going to use my fingers to tighten it up just enough that it doesn't rattle and figure out what that sounds like, individual hits and a little bit of grooving. Also, please stick around to the very end where we will display back-to-back comparisons of everything so you can hear them just one after another and really get a good idea of the differences. this all sounds pretty awesome to me, frankly. And the first thing I want to say is that the snare didn't really change very much. It changed a very small amount. I am chalking that up to the die-cast hoops and the fact that it's a 10-lug drum, because there is quite a bit of pressure from the adjacent lugs to the one that I took out. There's a slight change in the overall pitch, but it doesn't sound like it's wildly out of tune, which is kind of a cool facet of die-cast hoops on snare drums. Which is to say that if you're smashing away and things are moving around a little bit, largely it's going to hold the center of the tuning pretty good, at least until you can adjust it at some point later on. The rack tom, I intentionally put a little higher than I normally tune it, because when you're dealing with a 6-lug drum that's not tuned at snare drum tension and you take one lug out, you're actually really changing the tension on all of the lugs, because the whole head is going to slide a little bit toward the ones that are still under tension, and you're going to experience a much larger pitch differential and a much larger loss of sustain, which is what's cool about this technique, especially if you're doing like metal stuff or things where you need a lot of articulation. You're going to be playing very fast, but you don't want to go to the trouble of tuning the whole kit specifically to that and trying to make it in tune and also do that, which in some drum sets can be a real challenge. I have some experience with that, and I'll talk about that later. Now, the floor tom, I put down in the range that I normally tune it, which is pretty low, to display that if the drum is already low and you take a lug out, it's possible you're going to get into growling, rasping, one of the lugs is out sounding territory pretty fast, which isn't bad. It's a choice. And it's not just like going to dry the drum out and make it more manageable. It may actually take it into some kind of weird territory. Which honestly, in this tuning, sounds weirder where I'm sitting than it does in the microphones, which is important to know, because if you're playing live or if you're recording, just because they sound crazy or great where you're sitting does not mean that the audience is experiencing that, or that the microphones are experiencing that, or that all of the microphones are experiencing that. Like, raspy sounds might be weird in the close mic and awesome out in the room. You know, it's really, really hard to say. So you just have to test it and see in the context that you're in if it's a thing that's going to work for you or if it's just bananas and you can't use it. Now, lastly, the bass drum is one. This is actually a drum that I do this to a lot, and particularly for pop stuff and funk stuff and things like that, because I don't particularly like the feel of a super slack batter head on a bass drum, especially if it's got a pillow in it and we're dealing with like a drier, punchy kind of modern sound. I like that feeling of tension because I like to use the rebound off the bass drum, which is not everybody's bag, and that's okay. But for me, something that is very effective is to, similarly to the rack tom, pitch the batter head a little past tonally where it makes sense for the music, and then take one of the lugs all the way down to just finger tight. And it has this incredible way of dropping the whole pitch of the head and really dialing down the sustain inherent in a really resonant bass drum, even if there's muffling in the drum. And it's such a quick fix because it's right there in front of you, and if you're hitting the drum and you're thinking, this is out of control, this is too much, you don't have to get down there and do every single lug. You can just do it to one. I will do this to the top 2 lugs sometimes for the same reason that the snare drum really doesn't change that much when you only do one. This is a 10-lug drum. There's a lot of nodes of pressure, so sometimes 2 will get the job done, but you can start with 1, and then if it's not getting there, try 1 more, go as far as you need to go. This can also be really helpful for players who are more into burying the beater in the batter head than playing off of it. If you want to use a drum with a little bit less muffling and you're struggling with that sort of flutter when you press the beater into the head, detuning a lug or 2 will inhibit the head's ability to resonate just a little bit. And there's a little bit of wiggle room there where you can still get that good kind of solid impact feel when you're really digging into it. And it'll feel a little more like a drum that's got normal amounts of muffling in it for that kind of tuning. Make it a little more manageable for making that switch to a more kind of like boomy kind of bass drum sound. Now, as an aside for me, just because I'm curious, when we detune 1 on the snare, we're not feeling a big difference. I want to detune 2 on the snare. And rather than doing, 2 random ones, I'm going to do 2 adjacent ones to kind of get the node of lack of tension in the same spot. If you've seen our mass off tuning video, we've kind of been down this before, but that was a more meticulous, like a system kind of thing. This is just, I want more to happen in this direction, and I want to see what it does. Well, That sounds wild and low and kind of clangy and crazy. It is a usable sound. It's not an everyday sound for me. With some substantial muffling on it, like, you know, maybe some napkins taped on or something like that, you could get into a rad kind of thumpy loop sort of vibe or something like that. But when you start to do this to a snare drum where you're relieving that much tension in one location, you're definitely starting to throw the overtones off and starting to confuse the fundamental as far as like what it is. And you might be able to hear that my strike zone shifting an inch or two is really changing the sound. So it also brings to mind accuracy if you're going to start doing things like this. Now, since we're here and we're curious, and we hope you're curious too, we're going to go the other way, and we're going to take one lug and tune it very, very high. We're going to take the same lug, in fact, and just go past. For those of you that want to get into intervals, we're going about a whole step or 2 half steps past where the rest of the lugs are tuned on all 3 of these drums. I went a little further on the bass drum because since it's such a big head, you have to be a little more dramatic to get an effect out of it. And this is fun because I sort of knew what was going to happen before, and now I have no idea what's going to happen. So let's find out. Well, I learned some things. I learned that one lug on the snare drum going really, really high took the whole drum much, much higher, like all the way to ska territory without touching anything else, which is a great lesson in the fact that every one of these is important and every one of them has the ability to make or break or define the sound of the drum that you're playing. Similarly with the rack tom, it got real high real fast, and it sounds a lot more separated from all of the other drums. It's almost a little bit timbale-ish. Again, it was just one lug, which is super interesting because we think of these things as all sort of being equally democratic in the sound of the drum. But if one of them starts yelling, nobody else can do their job. You know, it's that kind of vibe. On the floor tom, similar to the rack tom, a little less dramatic because it is so low. It's still kind of in the low territory. A little more overtony, but still usable, totally usable. The kick drum, on the other hand, kind of awesome. It turned into more of a cannon, a lot more tone, a lot more sustain, and kind of Bonham-ish kind of vibes to it. Even though it is a ported front head, it's real different than when we detuned that lug. And again, this was just one. I didn't do 2 on the bass drum like I was talking about earlier. This is just the same stuff messing with one lug. So there's a lot of power in knowing what happens when you just make small adjustments or relatively small adjustments like this, rather than feeling like you have to do the whole drum every time in order to be able to call it a valid sound. Now, PSA time. Both in the Mass-Off video and probably in this video too, and in some other ones that are sort of unrelated, we have had a lot of people curious about uneven tuning or extreme tuning, different kinds of tuning, damaging their drum. They bring up the bearing edges a lot. Occasionally they mention the lugs. Some people mention the hoops, things like that. We are not totally sure where these concerns originally grew out of, if there is such a thing as an origin story for this. But suffice to say, this is not a thing you need to be worrying about at the tensions that a drum can even be put at with your hands in a drum key. We've done a lot of obscure, weird tunings here. I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sessions that were just totally bizarro tunings, weird things. I've used lots of other people's drums, old drums that weren't even in the round but had a cool sound. But the bottom line is, it's not going to damage your drum. It's just not. There are many other things to worry about with regards to maintaining your instrument than whether the head is in even tension. And just as an aside, you know, Ben has worked in the creating and manufacturing designing of drum heads in his life, and he has been privy to seeing in excess of 1.5 to 2 tons of pressure put on drum heads over and over and over on the same shell with the same rim and the same hardware. No damage to anything. The heads also survived it more often than not, but the drum never had a problem. If that's something that you're worried about and you're reticent to try things like this, it's just not an issue. It's not a thing you need to worry about. You're more likely to drop your drum and hurt it than to tension it in any way. It's fair to say that the head would give out before the drum would actually experience any damage. Now, if you're messing around with Kevlar aramid fiber heads, that's a different story. That's really specific. We talked about that in a video about that. Those heads don't stretch, and they can do things to a drum if you take them into the stratosphere. But that's a different deal. This is Mylar, this is plastic, and it is the thing that's gonna give, not the drum. All right, for the intrepid viewers who made it to the end, here is the back-to-back of all the variations of this kit under a single tuning, just adjusting one lug on each drum. All right, that about wraps it up. We went through them. There's a lot of usable stuff in here. There's some things that are a little iffy, cantankerous, but still sound like drums, which is super groovy. And I definitely found some stuff that I'm going to experiment with, particularly in terms of how these sounds translate to microphones, which, you know, you don't always get a chance to experiment with that stuff when you're at a session, and that's one of the things that I love about doing this. Thanks again to ProMark by D'Addario for being our presenting sponsor. Please go and check out the Patreon for additional content for this and all of our videos, anecdotes, extra playing footage, some comparisons. We got a lot of stuff in the hopper coming up that I'm super excited about. And thanks to everyone that's been supporting us over there. It really means a lot, and it makes us excited to work on this stuff and also helps us to afford to keep making it. And lastly, if this is a thing that you do in your life, if you have systems or techniques or certain drums you do it to, what are they? Why do you do it? What are you looking for when you do it? Do you take the lug all the way out and throw it on the floor? Do you finger tight it? Is there, you know, what is it? Because I'm actually really curious. This is a whole new world for me. And let us know in the comments. Tell us your stories, and I'll look forward to it. See you out there.